All right. We are in class number 30 of what is going to be 32, so we're definitely getting down to the end here. I do not believe that we will cover all of my material today. I am usually quite adept at zipping through hundreds of years of history. However, I just got so much material, it's kind of crazy here, of what we will attempt to cover today, so it's probably not going to happen. So most likely what we're going to have is, instead of, you can even see on the screen there, when I originally put this together, I had 3 what happens next classes, and kind of jammed United and Divided Kingdoms together. So probably the next 3 classes will just be a run-on, and we'll just finish where we finish, and we'll pick up where we pick up, and then we'll review a little bit at the end of class here. So of course, we are supposed to be talking about, and we are going to start with this idea of both the United and the Divided Kingdom here. Uh-oh. Well, that's not great. Well, I guess we'll see if that'll come back up or not. So when we look at this idea of the United Kingdom, whenever we talk through these different periods in history, anytime we talk about this, I always try to look at these sections of history. How do they play a part in the overall Bible picture? What did it really look like? What is going to be the important part of that? Excuse me for one second. I know that at one of these, there is a nice little power outlet. Well, there's one all the way back here. That seemed up front. Well, I guess we will just, I won't get to know what's coming next any more than you do. How about that? We'll find it out together. So this idea that everything happens, and God has put this in place for a reason. We may not always know the reason, but we can usually guess from the evidence that's given here. So when we look at the purpose of the United Kingdom, it looks back and forward. So looking backwards, the real purpose of the United Kingdom here is to finally actually completely fulfill the vast majority of the promise to Abraham. So you may remember that the promise to Abraham was made up of 5 primary components. They would have a land, a great name, there would be a great nation, and there would be the blessings and cursings upon them, to protect them. And then, of course, the final one, through all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So by the time we get through or even getting started in the United Kingdom, of these 5, how many have been fulfilled? 4, that's right. Okay, so the first 4, they have the land, they now have a great name. You can argue when do they actually become a kingdom, but definitely when they get kings and David and Solomon make them a great nation. And then, of course, the blessings and cursings have happened. So the only thing that has still not happened yet is this: all families of the earth are going to be blessed. And the United Kingdom has a part in that too, because looking forward, it's going to show God's people about kingship, what a godly king should look like, what an earthly king is going to look like. Provide that physical lesson on the kingdom that we talked about on Wednesday here. Show God could make an earthly kingdom if he wanted to. That's very important when we start talking about Jesus came back. Did Jesus fulfill what he was supposed to do here while he was on this earth? There are so many people who say, well, he really came to make an earthly kingdom like David, but it wasn't the right time, so he had to go with plan B. Does God ever go with plan B? No, what God wants to happen, happens. If he wanted Jesus to make an earthly kingdom, we can see he's done that in the past. He surely could have done it again. Of course, we're going to have a place for the temple to be built, and all that the temple means moving forward here. And then, of course, a way to fulfill that final element of the promise to David, of the promise to Abraham. We're going to see that promise repeated here, and more details are going to be flushed out in the United Kingdom. So on Wednesday, we talked about this idea of what reasons do they give for wanting a king. Samuel's old, His sons are not judges like him. They want a king to judge them. They wanted to be like the other nations, and they wanted a king who would fight their battles, okay? That's the reasons that they tell Samuel, we want a king. So Samuel does as God says, and before he actually makes them a king, he warns them, well, this is what a king's going to do. He's going to take your sons and daughters. He's going to take your flocks. He's going to take your servants. He's going to take the best of absolutely everything you have. And at the end of the day, he's even going to take you, and he's going to make you his servants. And that is ultimately fulfilled actually in Solomon, who over the course of his 40 years as king, everybody in the nation becomes a servant at least one time during his thing here, okay? And their response was, of course, yes, that's fine. We're okay with all of that. Give us a king anyway. So a guy named Saul is selected, going to be the first king of Israel here. And basically, he is the perfect king from a physical standpoint, right? Okay? He's very physically impressive. What do we know about Saul compared to all the rest of Israel? Yeah, head and shoulders, right? Okay. Also the most handsome man in all of Israel, it says here, okay? If you were going to actually say, what should a king look like, you would have picked Saul. Out of all of the people in Israel, he was the one who most physically represented a king. And when he starts out, he's very humble, okay? And he has the right attitude. He considers himself the least of all people, okay? Surprised and even scared of the attention. So scared of it, he actually does what? He hides. That's right. He hides and tries to not be made king here, okay? In order to get that done. And he actually does what they wanted, okay? What was the primary reason that the Israelites wanted a king? Fight their battles, exactly. So he is going to do that. He brings the entire nation to battle almost immediately. He raises an army of 330,000, by far the largest army that they have had in hundreds of years. He raises this army. He had to threaten them to come, but still they came, okay? And he defeats the enemy, who is the what? Who's the primary enemy throughout all the United Kingdom, actually? The Philistines, that's right, Philistia, okay? So he defeats the Ammonites in one morning and then goes on to defeat the Philistines and scatters so thoroughly that no two are left together, it says here, okay? We saw on Wednesday how that at the beginning, the end of Judges, the beginning of Saul's reign, Israel's in trouble. So they only really had this very small territory here that they had been compressed to. Okay, so Saul, in his first several years, he actually pushes back against the, if you'll plug that in, I'll take it, just to help me keep going here. I wouldn't have gone and hunted it down myself, but if she's willing, I will take advantage. So in 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 47 through 48, we really find about all the places that Saul pushes back. And you may recognize some of these from Wednesday, where we said these were the people who were pushing in. The Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, Zobah, the Philistines, the Amalekites, okay? These are all of the people that Saul pushes back to, thank you, so that by the end of his first couple years, he has doubled, actually, the territory that they are now able to live in, okay? So he is really back on track and doing exactly what Israel wanted in a king here. And of course, things start out really good. He comes to the rescue. He started out being the king God wanted him to be. He shows mercy to his distractors, the people who said, no, you're not the right guy. Instead of killing them like he wanted to, he ends up showing mercy to them like God wanted, okay? very common that the first act of a king when they come into power is to kill everybody who was against them. Okay, but he chooses not to do that and follows a more godly way here. All right. Well, we're still going to die anyway. That is not apparently actually got power there. Yep. Oh well. Oh well. And he gives God the glory for all of his successes here. Again, showing that humility, gives God credit for the battle. And again, at the end of that, he lists that as the basis for his mercy to his distractors. However, we're going to see that Saul makes 4 primary mistakes over his kingship that are really going to cost him everything. And every single one of these mistakes show that he loses that initial humility. He starts to believe his own hype, and he really turns into the kind of king that all of the nations around them had. Okay, so let's look at these 4 big mistakes. The first one is after that first battle and after everything is going so good, now there's going to be another battle, and Samuel tells him, gather the army, and I will come. You wait until I get there. We'll offer sacrifice, and then God will give you victory. But of course, he gets impatient, and he just doesn't wait. Okay. Then when Samuel gets there, he's very unrepentant and tries to justify his actions, and justifies the mean kind of argument here. So because of this, God decrees that his line was not continue as kings. You could have had your throne last forever, but because already you are showing that you aren't going to follow my path, your sons will not become king after you here. Okay? The second one, he makes a stupid oath. Again, they're fighting the Philistines, and during the battle, Israel is kind of holding back a little bit. So to push his soldiers into battle, he makes this vow that if anybody stops to eat until the battle's over, we're going to kill those people. That doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense, but it's the argument he makes here, okay? And as king, he can do that. However, anybody remember who eats? Jonathan, his son, that's right, okay? So his son Jonathan, who ends up being the big hero of the battle, but he and his men go ahead and eat because they had been sent out earlier and they didn't hear this command. So crazily, Saul actually tries to kill his own son and the men who were the hero of this battle, okay? But the people step in and stop him and say, there's no way we're going to kill Jonathan. He's the one who saved us all here, not you. So this rift between Saul and Jonathan begins. He alienates his own son, and that's going to become very important because of Jonathan's relationship with the next king. Okay. His third mistake, he fails to do as commanded. God had told him it's time for final revenge to be enacted upon the Amalekites who had attacked the children of Israel as they were coming up through. You go and wipe them out. But instead, he saves the king and all the spoils. Okay? And when Samuel first comes to him, he says, hey, I did everything God told me to do. And we remember Samuel's kind of famous response?
Why do I hear the bleating?
Yeah, the bleating of the sheep, right? If you killed everything, how come I hear all this great uproar of the flocks and all this kind of stuff? And so then he backtracked, well, the people made me do it. Of course, Samuel holds him and responsible, and God now, this mistake has gone a step further. So not only now are you not going to, your son going to be king, but now you are done being king. And actually, Samuel leaves this meeting and immediately on his way home finds and anoints David. So Saul is going to lose the kingdom now because of this third mistake here. And we see here that Samuel does not see Saul again. Okay? Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Terrible statement of just the decay of Saul and his kingship here. Of Of course, I only put this up there because it's one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. Samuel fixes the problem. Then Samuel said, "Bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites." And Agag came to him cheerfully, thinking he's going to be saved. Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." And Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Perhaps one of my favorite verses in the Bible. Okay. So his fourth mistake then really ends up being the one that is just going to seal the deal here. And this is again in a battle with the Philistines here. He's going to show himself to be a coward. So we know that in this, one of the final battles of Saul's life here, actually second to last battle here, they all get arrayed for war, and so do the Philistines. And then, of course, Goliath makes his challenge, right? Hey, there's no reason for all of us to die. You send out one champion, we'll fight, and whoever wins, the other army is just going to give up, okay? Who is the person who should have fought this battle? Saul, right? Saul should have been the one to step up, okay? Because he was the tallest, he was the biggest, he was the king, and if God was behind him, there's no way he could have lost, okay? However, who did step up? David, just a lowly shepherd boy, right? This really is the beginning of the end then here, okay? Saul, after this battle, because David showed such courage, even though he's a youth, Saul is forced to turn the armies over to David, and this begins the people starting to follow David instead of Saul. So much so that it becomes obvious to absolutely everyone that the Lord was with David and the Lord was no longer with Saul here, okay? And we see that the verses say, "So Saul eyed David from that day forward. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul." Now that shouldn't have been a surprise to Saul, because what had Samuel told him after his last mistake? That's it, you're out, okay? But still, that really is going to be the end of Saul here. So for his remaining days, he's surrounded by all of his enemies. He's ignored by God. Saul eventually turns to witchcraft in chapter 8. This is just how poor things get. The medium of Endor actually calls up Samuel, and we see the terrible pronouncement on him. "Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." And of course, that is exactly what happens. The battle goes as Samuel had promised. Israel starts to fall. All of Saul's sons are killed. And how does Saul actually die? Anybody remember? What's that? Yeah, he actually commits suicide here, right? Okay. So he was wounded by arrows and does not want the Philistines to be able to claim that they killed him. His armor bearer won't kill him, which actually is part of his job. He's supposed to do that, but he won't. He just says, "I'm not going to do that." And so Saul falls on his sword and he dies there, okay? Which takes us to David. And there are so many things we could say about David, but we just want to cover some of the basics here and how this really leads us forward. When we look at David's family, of course, he was the father of Jesse, the youngest of 8 sons. We also know that he was from whose family that we just studied? Ruth, right? Okay, Ruth was in his lineage here. Why was David chosen? He doesn't look the part of a king. If you were to physically select a king, Saul being the absolute picture-perfect glimpse of what a physical king should be, what is David? Exact opposite. He's small, not very strong, the youngest and smallest in his family here. But yet, 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance, nor the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Okay? So again, he's the exact opposite of Saul. Samuel's even like, there's no way this kid can be king, but God says he's going to be the guy here, okay? What tribe was he from? That's right, from the tribe of Judah. What town? Bethlehem, okay? Why are these two facts important, of course? Yeah, the prophecies, okay? It's going to be the city and the tribe that Jesus is going to be from here. I just put together this kind of brief summary of some of the things that happened to David over his life here. Of course, he's chosen to be king when very young. We don't know for sure, but probably somewhere in 15 to 16 years of age, maybe as old as 17, whenever he's chosen to be king. He fights with Goliath, the Philistines, not very much after that. Potentially 3 years later, we're not exactly sure, but still definitely a youth in his teens whenever he fights with the Philistines and gets control of the whole army. He serves under King Saul for a few years, so 20 to 22 or so. Spends the better part of 6 years running and hiding from Saul. Okay, so let's say that puts him up to age 28 or so. He becomes recognized as the king of Judah when he is 30. We know that age, actually. So he's 30 years old. That's how I came up with the rest of the ages backwards, actually. So we know that he is recognized as king of Judah when he's 30, but only Judah, right? Okay. And then, of course, he's recognized as the king of united Israel 7 years later. It takes him 7 years to finally completely step out of Saul's shadow and to step up and become the united king of Israel, because the rest of the tribes besides Judah try to keep Saul's family in charge there, okay? And then he reigns a total of 40 years before dying. So it's believed that count is from his time when he started as Judah, not when he started as king of the united Israel, okay? Of course, David has this great big idea. What's David's big idea? Anybody remember? Want to build the temple, that's right, okay? So he decides that he needs to build God a house instead of just this lowly tent. And just shows again this character of David as opposed to Saul. Saul's the one who built this huge palace to himself. And David, whenever he becomes king, he says, wait a minute, it's not right that I should live in this huge palace, but God only has this tiny little tent here, okay? What does the prophet Nathan think of that idea? Anybody remember? Yeah, Nathan's like, all right, yeah, let's go, okay? Sounds great. But he doesn't consult God about this, okay? So God comes back with this idea, hey, did I ask you to do this? I don't need you to build me a house. If I wanted a house, I would have told you to build it, okay? But apparently he's still not upset with David. David doesn't get any real chastisement for this idea. However, God recognizes him and exalts him by saying, no, I will build you a house. And of course, then we see these promises to David here. Your son will build my house. So, of course, the next king is going to be the one who's actually going to build the temple here. No really reason expressed here, but David was told why. Why was David not allowed? Too much blood, that's right, okay, where God wanted his house to be a house of peace, okay, and that's in 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 7 through 9, we find that, okay. So David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house to the name of the Lord my God, but by the word of the Lord came to me, saying, you have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood before me on the earth. Behold, a son will be born to you who shall be a man of rest. I will give him rest for all of his surrounding enemies, for his name shall be Solomon, and I will give him peace and quiet to Israel, to Israel in his days. Okay. So then as part of this, we see in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the promise to David, one of the key foundational passages of the entire Old Testament because of how it carries this story along. So verses 11 through 16, we find these elements of the promise to David. David's seed would be established forever. David's kingdom would be established forever. His throne would be established forever, and his seed would have a father-son relationship with God. So remember, of those elements to the promise to Abraham, we only have the one element that has not been fulfilled. What is God doing here? He's providing more details. That's right. This is how I'm going to now complete that last element here, okay? It gives us those details about God's plan. the key passage to understanding Christ's role, and that Christ was going to be the one that is going to be that ultimate fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, okay? This is the passage that Peter used in his first sermon to explain Jesus is the fulfillment of these promises here, okay? Key to understanding who Jesus was. This is also important because it now provides a new engine to drive the rest of the Old Testament here. The promise to Abraham has only been 80% fulfilled. So if we have this short timeline here of kind of history, from Adam to Abraham, there was really no direction. And in fact, when we look at the story, what is true about man? It's kind of wandering all over the place, right? Okay. But now Abraham comes along. We have that promise to Abraham that drives the rest of the story. It's Abraham's family and how they become this great nation. How is at least the majority of this promise to Abraham fulfilled? Now we are going to see that this promise to David is what's going to drive us the rest of the Bible story up to Christ. And then, of course, Jesus makes a promise, his promise to return is what drives the story after Jesus through today here, okay? So the three promises that the entire Bible story are built on, two of them center, one of them find most of its completion, and the second one starts here in David. What kind of promise is it? Is it conditional or unconditional promise? It's unconditional, right? Okay. This is one of those promises that God didn't say, these things will happen if you behave. These things will happen if your descendants are faithful. This is one of the things God just said, this is what's going to happen. God's the only one who can make that kind of promise here, okay? And it's one of those things that does not rely on man's faithfulness, but instead relies on God's faithfulness to complete that, okay? So now Solomon is going to be born, just as God had told David he was going to have a son named Solomon. It's interesting, he's the son of Bathsheba. David's perhaps greatest mistake was, of course, the sin with Bathsheba there, but yet Solomon is going to be one of her sons. Interesting to note, he's not actually the eldest son, okay? Pretty important there. He's not the one who it normally would have gone to, but God kind of guides his choice here, and he is the one that is appointed heir by David. However, he does inherit some of the consequences of his father's sins. He's not held responsible for them, but he does inherit those consequences. What's the primary consequences that David was plagued with his entire life, and Solomon is going to be continue to be plagued with? Family, that's right, family problems, that's right, okay? Primarily it's trouble in the family there. All kinds of sexual sin and rebellion had happened in David's family, and so there's going to be this big continuation of that into Solomon's reign here. So Solomon does build the temple. And of course, it is modeled after almost the exact same as we would say for the tabernacle here, okay? Except for now, instead of tent walls, they are actual stone walls, okay? Lots of gold, lots of fancy wood used in it. And Solomon is the one who actually built it, but who designed and prepped for it? David actually did, yes. Not with God's help, of course, but David is the one who got everything ready. Even though he was not allowed to build it, during David's reign, he's the one, he gets all the gold, he gets all the wood, he gets all the skilled tradesmen lined up. So basically, I think he even kind of starts on the foundation, if I remember correctly. So basically, when he dies and Solomon takes over, immediately what is ready to happen? Construction of the temple, okay? Of course, the temple, we can't hardly overstate its importance here. It becomes God's physical dwelling place. It sets the example that spirit could inhabit a physical location. Of course, that plays a part in the Spirit inhabiting us. It becomes the symbol of the nation, okay? The true source of authority in the land comes not by the king, but from God, okay? And of course, continues this theme of God dwelling among his people. Now, instead of having a tent, which served the people when they were wandering. Now that they have a nation and they are solidified in the land, there is a more permanent place for God to dwell as well here. We then see at the commencement of the temple here, we see the promise to Solomon. So just like when we saw Abraham, the promise was repeated to Jacob and to Isaac, or Isaac and then Jacob, I should say. But we see that the promise is going to be made to Solomon, okay? 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, we find this promise. This is a conditional promise, however, okay? And the big thing about that is, I will be with you, and your kings, your sons will stay on the throne forever, as long as you what? Follow me and keep my commandments. However, what do we know about Solomon? He doesn't really do that, right? He does it somewhat, but not completely here, okay? So that is really what's going to lead us up here to this idea of the divided kingdom. The primary reasons for the division were Solomon's unfaithfulness. That's the first and foremost, this terrible heavy burden of taxes that he has placed on all of the people, not only to complete the temple, because most of that David had actually raised the materials for, but Solomon goes on this building spree, right? And just completely builds everywhere, and everybody becomes indentured servants. They become part of this workforce. They don't have a choice. And so really all these things are just kind of mounting here. They follow away from following the law as a nation, they do here. And so the kingdom is going to be torn. Why did the kingdom of Israel split? Oftentimes we read 1 Kings chapter 12, which is this very famous story. Solomon has died and his son, now the people come to his son and say what? We will follow you if only you will do what? Yeah, ease the burden. That's right, okay? And we use this passage when we talk to young people because as a young king, he goes to his two different advisors. One is his dad's older, wiser advisors, and what do they say? Do it. Give the people what they want. But his younger, think they know everything advisors, tell him what? Yeah. They thought they had it bad before, make it worse, right? Okay. And of course, who does he listen to? He listens to his friends. Okay. However, the split wasn't caused by Rehoboam's poor choice. What was the split caused by? God as part of Solomon's unfaithfulness, right? The kingdom was torn to pieces because of Solomon's unfaithfulness. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 11 through 13, we see here, therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and I will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all of the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen here. Now, does the choice that Rehoboam makes have a part? Yes, but it's only the vehicle by which God is seeing his will done, okay? Rehoboam, no matter what choice he had made, the kingdom was going to be torn out of his hands. It was just a matter of how was that going to be accomplished. Now, when we think about Jeroboam, and if you have never heard the trick, which one is which, right? The J's don't match. So Jeroboam does not lead in Judah. Just remember that and it'll help you keep those. What's that?
Rehoboam starts with R, which makes it right. He's the right son.
Okay, Rehoboam starts with R, so it makes him the right son. Yeah, except for, well, yeah, okay. So was Jeroboam then a bad guy for rebelling against Rehoboam and splitting the nation? No, he wasn't a bad guy. That's right. He wasn't a bad guy because God told him to do it. Okay? 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 27 to 36, we have Jeroboam being told, you're going to get the 10 pieces, right? Remember that whole thing about the cloak being torn, all that kind of stuff, okay? So Jeroboam was from the tribe of Ephraim, son of Nebat and Zeru. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, remember that phrase there. He was a mighty man of valor, a great warrior, set to be the leader over the whole tribe of Ephraim. And then, of course, Ahijah comes along and tears his garment into 12 pieces. It's interesting. Jeroboam was told he's going to get how many? 10. But God already told Solomon, your son's going to have how many? 1. One tribe is only going to be ruled by Solomon's son. So what happened to the other piece of the cloak? What happened to the other tribe? Well, we don't really know for sure, but there's 2 possible options here. One could be Simeon. We don't really hear about Simeon anymore. Remember how we talked about that when they went and possessed the land, Judah was given that big portion, and Simeon just had that little section within Judah? In fact, Judah said, even though it wasn't the actual boys, remember it says, Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come with me and we will go possess the land. Pretty much Simeon just gets absorbed by Judah. That's one possible option. The other possible option is Simeon's descendants have moved out of Judah up north, and that is talking about the Levites being that. But that doesn't really seem to make sense because the Levites never had territory, right? So it really does seem to be more that Simeon just kind of falls out of the picture here. If we talk about the characteristics of the divided kingdom, then really the number one overriding characteristic is this complete lack of leadership, okay? The kings rarely fulfill their obligation to the people and almost never fulfill their obligation to God, okay? Because of that, both nations, Judah and Israel, are going to struggle with their identity. Just like we saw in the period of the Judges, we are going to see another moral free fall here. Things were set back on track in the United Kingdom, a little bit with Saul, but then definitely with David as he, brought the ark back into Jerusalem and really kick-started worship of Jehovah again, started to fall away with Solomon, and now it's really going to fall in the divided kingdom here. Judah does a little bit better than Israel, but not much, honestly, okay? And it's really not only a decay of the leadership, but the people themselves fall back into all the old kind of sins here. So if we were going to look at that, Israel, we see pretty much just almost a constant decline. There is a little bit of a flat period there. There's one king in all of the kings of Israel who is kind of good. In fact, it says he did the will of the Lord. Anybody remember who that is? Jehu. And what did Jehu do? He killed all of somebody's family. Who's that? Yeah, that's right, okay? Ahaz and Omri's family, right? Okay, killed them all. And so for a while, he kind of holds off this descent and he does the will of the Lord, but he never really leaves the primary sin of Israel. We'll talk about that in a minute here. Judah, of course, goes up and down based on the faithfulness of their king. If we were to compare the two nations here, Judah, of course, they primarily do follow Judaism. They follow the law. They worship in the temple. They have sacrifices to Jehovah there in Jerusalem, okay? Israel follows idolatry, kind of a perverted version of Judaism here. As remember, Jeroboam is worried that all the people going to Jerusalem are going to leave him, and so he creates those two idols of golden calves, puts them at Dan and Beersheba, and says, hey, you guys worship here, okay? In the south, in Judah, there's a single dynasty for their entire time. It's the family of David. In Israel, there's many dynasties. It becomes a rule by might. If you are strong enough to kill the previous king and his sons, you can become king yourself. The south is relatively stable. Of course, in the north, as you can imagine, anytime you have that dynastic change, you're going to have a lot of instability politically. Judah pretty much follows what God wanted them to do, and they stay as kind of an isolated nation here. They don't do a lot of trade with everybody else, except for Israel. They do a ton of trade with Israel. However, Israel in the north, man, they start trading with everybody, and they actually become kind of well-known in the region there for being able to do that. Judah, however, because it stays very small, doesn't do a lot of trading, Judah, for the rest of its history, is predominantly poor, okay? Almost all of their industry is agricultural. However, Israel actually becomes very wealthy in the north. Several times they are plundered because they have been able to gather so much wealth. Just because they are doing a lot of trading, they're very strong in trade. They have some more advanced technology than Judah does. And we see that there is this constant looking from the kings of Judah to the kings of Israel and kind of wishing they had what Israel had. Okay? So if there was a purpose of the united kingdom, what's the purpose of the divided kingdom? Of course, we're driving toward the fulfillment of these promises, the promises to Abraham and David. It shows what happens when people wander from God. They had everything. At the time of Solomon, they were literally the greatest nation on earth, but yet they squander it by being unfaithful here. And of course, it proves that God will keep his promises, not only the good stuff. That's an important part here, right? Remember back in Joshua, when we started at the end of Joshua, our first book that we looked at in this class, one of the things that Joshua said in his final goodbye here, and I am now about to go the way of the earth, and you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass, and not one of them has failed. God told you all these good things were going to happen, and what has he done? He's done it. He's given it to you, okay? But Joshua continues, but just as all the good things that the Lord your God has promised concerning you have been fulfilled, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from off of this good land that the Lord your God has given you. Extremely prophetic, right? If you behave, you're going to continue to get the good. If you don't behave, God's going to punish you and eventually destroy you off of the land if that's how far it has to go. So if we talk about these two kingdoms, let's talk for a little bit about the northern kingdom and primarily the apostasy that they have here. Of course, we talked about Jeroboam, how he was promised he was going to take over Israel. And again, he's promised, and if you will listen to all that I command you, and you will walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did. Notice he said David, not Solomon, okay? I will be with you, and I will build you a sure house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. So Jeroboam again gets this great promise, but it's conditional. If. Okay? However, we see Jeroboam makes this terrible sin. He's afraid that people are going to return to Jerusalem, and that while they're there, their hearts are going to return to the house of David, and he's going to no longer be the king. So he makes this perverted form of Judaism that we already talked about, made golden calves for Dan at Bethel here. And so, of course, if we looked at overall the land at the end of the time of Solomon, we know that Judah is going to be in the south, and Israel pretty much takes over what was left, and those other territories just kind of get lost. Anytime you don't have a king, because most of that, if I go back there, most of that Israel controlled, but they only controlled by treaty, right? So David was a king of conquest. He took over the land by defeating the armies. Solomon was a king of treaties, and he made all kinds of treaties, almost always sealed by marrying one of the other princesses, right? Okay. So we see when it's split between Judah and Israel, the rest of that was kind of theirs by treaty is lost here. So, of course, he's worried that they're going to come south to Judah. So there's Jerusalem, of course. So Dan and Bethel are where he's going to place those golden calves so that anybody coming from the north, pretty much you would have had to pass through Bethel anyway to get to Jerusalem. So he just sets it up to where they can stop there and not make that last little bit to Jerusalem. Okay. He also sets up all kinds of special feast days that were not part of the law of Moses. If you want to win the people's hearts, you give them more vacation. So that's what he does. He gives them a bunch more days off, much more party days. And then he overrides this idea of the Levitical priesthood. And basically, you could be a priest, and he makes some of even the poorest of the poor. He makes them priests so that people feel like it could happen to them. But in reality, you can become a priest if you can what? If you can buy it. If you're rich enough, you can buy your way into the priesthood is what happens here, okay? So that becomes known as the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And every single king in the north, it starts out with, so-and-so became king of Israel, sometimes when he was this age and he ruled for this years, and he continued in the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which means he continued in what? This worship of the golden calves. Okay, I told you we wouldn't get